Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the latest GIBS Flash Forum. My name is Ronak Gopaldas. I'm a political economist, a director at Signal Risk, and a fellow here at GIBS. And today I'm joined by Professor Adrian Saville, who is a professor of business strategy and economics, also here at GIBS. And the reason we are with you today is to discuss an article that we recently wrote, Beyond the Doomsday Scenario, Reimagining Policies and Practice in a Post-COVID World. Now, this article garnered quite a lot of attention, elicited a lot of debate and discussion, and we've been asked to delve a little bit deeper, to scratch beneath the surface, and to share some of our insights with you. We're delighted to have you with us. We welcome your participation. Please send through your questions as and when the conversation does progress. Now, before we get into the meat of the discussion, for those of you who missed the article or haven't read it, I want to provide a quick summary, an executive summary around what we discussed. Now, myself and Adrian had a conversation a few weeks ago, and effectively what we did was we wanted to take stock of the current political and economic realities. We went back to the drawing board, and then we looked forward and presented a view of what a successful future in a post-COVID world might look like. On a more detailed level, we discussed the limitations of conventional policy measures. We looked at the need for a mindset shift across both the public and private sector from an either-or mentality to a both-and mentality. And then we extrapolated some of the practical examples across these sectors around what this reality could look like. The gist of the article was that, despite the fact that we are in tough times and we are in very much a doom and gloom kind of scenario, there is opportunity in crisis, and that we shouldn't waste the lessons and the opportunity for a reset that this pandemic presents. So at this point, I'd like to bring Adrian into the conversation. Adrian, we've said we'd like to structure this as a conversation in a bar between two friends. It's probably a little bit early for alcohol, although I believe it's quite cold in Joburg. But over to you.
Thanks, Ronak. So you refer to a world that no longer exists in a bar. I'm not sure where that happens, but what I thought would be useful in painting the backdrop to this discussion around the paper that we put together would be just sort of recounting the phone call that you and I had that led to us writing this. And if I recall, it was a Saturday, and we were speaking on that Saturday afternoon. And your observation to me was the machine is broken, and that restoration of the normal can't possibly be what we are pursuing. Yet that seems to be the policy ambition. Policy is talking about this fierce determination for a V-shaped recovery, get back to as we were as quickly as possible. And our discussion was around, well, is that really what we should be wishing for? So I thought, maybe we could just sketch some of that background to our thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It was a Saturday afternoon. Not much else to do on the weekends apart from work.
Couldn't meet in bars with friends.
Yeah, and I think both of us were quite disillusioned by the lack of creativity and the lack of imagination in policy responses. Everybody was talking about getting back to where we were in January 2020, as if everything was hunky-dory back then. And the reality is that what COVID-19 has done is that it's lifted a mirror for us, and it's exposed a lot of the deficiencies that we've had in our societies, whether it's political, whether it's economic, whether it's through healthcare or other dimensions. The disconnect between haves and have-nots and the levels of inequality in society. And instead of rushing back to that paradigm, we decided to pause, to reflect, to engage, and to think a little bit differently. And that, of course, was the genesis of the idea. We didn't really know how it would end up. But with a little bit of creativity, I think there are a number of examples which we'll unpack for the audience today around what the shifts that are being undertaken in the world today, how they might pan out, and what the future might look like.
So if we think about the policy initiatives that have been brought along to address the COVID crisis, markets have responded in a way that capital markets are delighted with the way policymakers have responded. When in some ways it's not so much a capital market response as capital markets actually being taken there. And I'm thinking of bond markets where interest rates have been taken to 0% in very near-term capital markets. And further along the spectrum, we've got the Fed now willing to buy junk bonds, corporate sub-investment grade debt. You've got central bankers participating in this market to try and help the US economy find its feet as quickly as possible. You've got a fiscal stimulus that, depending on whether we're talking about the United States, Germany, Japan, the fiscal stimulus is 10% of GDP, and fiercely trying to get those economies back to the shape they were in January. And I mean, my response to this has been heavily influenced by the thinking of people like the writer Arundhati Roy, who speaks about stepping through the portal, using the pandemic as a portal. You've referenced this as a mirror, which I think is, before you can step through anything, you first have to reflect on yourself. Where am I? How do we find ourselves in this circumstance? And that, I think, translates into a very sobering reality. And you've made references to aspects including governance, social, economic, and political attributes. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your thinking around where we find ourselves coming into this pandemic. Forget about where we're going to. How did we come in?
Yeah, so I mean, in many parts of the world, we were already in crisis before the crisis. So, let's take a step back and look at this from a global level first, and then we can look at the policy responses. So globally, we're in the throes of this healthcare pandemic, but then we've got a few other emergencies that are currently underway as well. We've got a climate emergency, and you've got a racism pandemic, which is seeing mass protests across the world. Now, the intersection of these issues means that we are really in uncharted territory. And the global response from a leadership perspective has been underwhelming in a lot of instances. And for me, this kind of does feel like we are in the midst of a fundamental reset. It's a radical, fundamental reset across the political, economic, and institutional architecture of the world. And, for me, there are references here to a throwback to 1989, where we saw some pretty seismic events in the world: Tiananmen Square, the Berlin Wall, and the release of Nelson Mandela, which saw us shift from this Cold War era to an era of the global liberal order. Now it seems like we're undergoing a similar kind of reset, and what's on the other side of that has not been thought out properly as yet. So we know that things are changing, but we're stuck on the here and now, not really focused on what comes next. Now, if you look at the economic responses, the questions we need to ask ourselves is whether this policy addresses the actual issues, or whether it's a knee-jerk reaction, or whether it's just a slapdash approach, which is going to hope to get us to a place that is better than we are. And the reality is that we need policy that is going to be sincere in what it does. Now, if you look at the limitations around some of the measures that we've discussed around the fiscal pump and the monetary hose, we've got to appreciate the context. And in the current context, you've got a few factors which make the effectiveness of these policies, these firefighting policies, a little bit less effective than they'd ordinarily be. So number one is that the fact is that we should not be retrogressive and go back to where we were, because the world has changed quite dramatically. The way we work, the way we operate, the ability to engage in real economic activity has changed. So we need to look forward rather than back. Secondly, if you're looking at fiscal policy in the current era, how do you get people to go out and spend money and stimulate the demand side of the economy in a context where you need social distancing? Then on the monetary side of things, it's one thing to make easy money available and give people cheap access to credit, but if they again can't go out and be productively engaged, it's going to be quite limited in terms of its effectiveness. And then, long-term policy formulation is changing quite dramatically because we've got a couple of shifts underway.
Ronak, I'm just going to jump in before you carry on, because it's all good and well to talk about interest rate stimulus and relief, but if your balance sheet has been taken deep into the water, and if you've lost your job, if you're one of the 130 million Indians that have lost their job, it's the US that gets all the headlines, but everywhere has been damaged. You've got very little protection and immunity. Your balance sheet is naked, and taking interest rates down to 0% might help you if you've got debt. But if you don't have a job, it's not interest rates, it's not repayment of the debt. You don't have cash flow.
Yeah, I mean, cash flow matters more than interest rates in a context where people are fighting for survival. And if you look at developed markets, they've got the resources to support workforces who are out of job and who are suffering. Not so much the case in emerging markets, which is where the debate between lives and livelihoods comes in, the debate between people and the economy, between lockdowns versus tracing and testing, and that kind of infrastructure. And again, the focus has been very much on getting the economy back to where it was, but we're dealing with human lives over here, and this is the challenge for governments around the world in terms of policy making, because effectively they find themselves in a triathlon of governance, trying to manage a political dimension, a healthcare dimension, and an economic dimension. And what a lot of governments have not realized is that it's no point doing one effectively without the other two. They need to be synchronized and coordinated and done in such a way that you get to the finish line and you have a future on the other side. And this is where I think, if we look at it in a South African context, initially the response was quite good in terms of the president providing calm assurance, taking the constituency and the citizenry into his confidence. The economic response was a bit underwhelming and full of contradictions. The healthcare response initially, again, was in line with World Health Organization guidelines and based on a scientific approach. But the problem is that these haven't been coordinated and they've been quite disjointed. And that, for me, is the challenge to policymakers across the globe, is to get that balance right. Sorry, Adrian, I can't hear you. Sorry, Adrian, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, I know, schoolboy error. This is the way that meetings start nowadays, is it's not, how are you? It's, can you hear me? The most overused line in the world. I was just saying that there's some questions that are in the chat, and we'll pick up on those as we go along. So please give us questions and we'll work some of the responses in, if not address them directly. And perhaps we could then take a step back in picking up on that first question, what are capital markets worried about right now? I would venture nothing. That capital markets have walked along as if there's nothing to see here, folks. It's all over and everything's going to be just fine. We make reference to this in the article by talking about the fiscal pump and the monetary fire hose. And the fiscal pump takes the shape of, in South Africa, the 500 billion stimulus package and cutting interest rates by 2.75% from the start of the crisis to now. The South African Reserve Bank stepping in to ease up liquidity in the markets. And all of it has helped capital markets overwhelmingly walk past where they started the year. So believe it or not, the S&P is into double-digit, S&P 500 is into double-digit returns so far this year. The bond market is quite comfortable with the circumstance, and that has translated into domestic markets. The JSE has sold off meaningfully, but has, since that deep March sell-off, has enjoyed substantial recovery. There's particular parts of capital markets that are worried, most obviously the property sector, where globally you've got the real estate sector really sort of working through some very, very difficult economic and financial terrain. But barring that specific asset class, many other asset classes, most other asset classes, have walked past this and said, nothing to see here, folks. And my favorite throwaway of this recently comes from a friend of mine in London, Dion Khoos, who put out a sort of a quirky tweet last week. And he says, afternoon, everyone. I've been asleep for the last 6 months. I've been offline. I haven't seen anything. I know that the S&P was here at the start of the year. I see it's up modestly now. Has anything interesting happened? I mean, that's the way capital markets have treated the 6 months. And I'll make the point again, you know, capital markets are walking on as if nothing to see here, folks. Of course, there's a huge amount that's still coming at them. And that's the financial results that have to be reported of this period. Those haven't been reported yet. And we'll see that in earnings and cash flow and in balance sheet. Our estimates point to corporate earnings falling by 70%. And we know that economies are going to recover, or likely recover, helped by this fierce fiscal and monetary stimulus. And there's a couple of aspects of this stimulus that really stand out. The first is, if you put the stimulus up against what was done in global financial crisis, it is substantially understating to say that this is a big stimulus. We are not doing 1 or 2 times global financial crisis. We're doing 5 and 10 times what was done in global financial crisis. The stimulus is absolutely monstrous. The overused word is unprecedented. The second thing that is striking about the stimulus is it's fiscal and monetary. So it's central banks and governments that are cutting rates and spending at the same time in a fierce fashion. So it's coordinated monetary and fiscal. It's a massive project or injection. And the third is it's not one country. Global financial crisis, it was the states that led, and then a couple of others came along. It's everyone in this together. Everyone is stimulating the economy at the same time with this monetary flamethrower and the fiscal pump.
So, Adrian,
the desperate attempt is to get economies back as quickly as possible to where they started 2020. And Ronak and my debate on that Saturday afternoon, an argument in this paper, is that's the last thing you want to do. You don't want to get back to where we started.
So, Adrian, I guess to pick up on that point, the question then that many people will be asking here is, are we going to get a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, an L or a W? And what do the contours of this look like? You've highlighted some of the differences between 2008 and now in terms of the nature of the crisis. I've also got some views on that, which I'll pick up on after you. But what's your view on the shape of the recovery?
Well, capital markets, which are generally very good forecasters, are saying that the recovery is V-shaped. That's the way that they've behaved. We can quickly get into debates about why equity markets, for instance, have bounced so quickly. No doubt there will be some people on this webinar who have sat through financial modeling courses and worked out discounted cash flows. And when your interest rate is 0, your future cash flow doesn't get discounted. And it allows you to quite comfortably put very, very elevated valuations. In fact, then when you take the way that interest rates have been moved in the bond market in the United States, and you put that up against the S&P, my point about the S&P bouncing as if there's nothing to see here might actually be misplaced, because what the S&P could be responding to is not the fact that earnings are going to recover so wonderfully, but rather that we're now applying much lower interest rates to discount those future earnings, as uncertain as they are. So this is the intriguing world of investment finance. But if we take it at face value, capital markets are saying it's a quick recovery. But that's not the evidence that we've got from China. And even if it is a quick recovery, and the reason why I reference China is first in, first out, that they'll give us some clues about how quickly markets and economies recover. But even if they do recover to former activity, they're certainly not recovering to recent levels of spending. So people might be going to malls, you might have road traffic and foot traffic, but you don't have the same level of economic activity. So you've got physical activity, but not economic activity that might look V-shape-ish. But then there is the big risk, and you reference this in the article where you write about the hangover. And the hangover takes the form of massively bloated government balance sheets, for instance, that someone's got to pay for this.
And on that point, what are the options? I mean, we've got an emergency budget coming out tomorrow in South Africa. You know, applying fiscal austerity seems politically challenging once you need to address this issue. Are we looking at things like financial repression, or what levers does the government have to pull in order to ensure the sustainability of public finances, in your opinion?
Well, you know, I'm thinking about maybe we can stay away from South Africa just for a moment, because I mean, there's real juice in that, and I've only got 24 hours to be wrong. This time tomorrow afternoon, we'll know. Maybe we can come back to the South African story. The global story is they are spending fiercely, and they're spending money that they don't have. So a screenshot was popped up of the size of the fiscal stimulus a moment back. So they're spending money that they don't have. All of this is borrowed money. It must translate into much, much bigger government balance sheets. And the mainstream, the conventional response amongst sort of economics 101 respondents would be to say, this is unsustainable. You can't build 100% debt to GDP and sustain it. I want to put two caveats or qualifications around it. The one is that's not entirely the case. Much depends on how you spend it. So if this money is very carefully spent, if it's wisely spent, and I'm reminded of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, where they put in place the spending package that built rural extension programs, a strong social and economic net for the agricultural sector in a United States economy that at that point, the 1930s, was still very agrarian and rural, that they put in infrastructure spending packages that had spillovers, multipliers, linkages, and those spillovers, multipliers, linkages went on for decades. Here we are, 100 years after that fiscal stimulus, and you've still got Las Vegas, Nevada, which was one of the spillovers of the Hoover Dam. You've still got the tunnels under the Hudson. That was one of the projects that was built. So, you know, you could spend the money badly, you could spend it well. If you spend it well, the economy will catch up and forgive that debt. So that's one aspect of the hangover that I think we need to reconcile or consider. The other is they're doing all of this in zero interest rates environments. So if interest rates are zero or even negative, German bonds are negative, I'm going to borrow 100 and I'll pay you back 90 in 10 years' time and you'll thank me.
That's
bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, I want to build on one of the comparisons that you've drawn and that I think is quite relevant to this discussion, which is the comparison to 2008 and the financial crisis then. Because I think, you know, this time around we're dealing with something quite significant, and there are a number of reasons why. Whereas that was a financial sector banking-led crisis that spilled over into the real economy. this one has primarily affected the real economy and limited the ability of people to find meaningful work. In addition to that, the global economy was in far healthier shape back then, before the crash, even though it maybe had a soft underbelly which was exposed. But I think moreover than that, you've had fundamental changes in global leadership and the global institutional makeup that we're seeing. So, you know, back then multilateralism was still commonplace, whereas now self-isolation, not only is it a feature of lockdown, but it's also a metaphor for some of the nationalistic sentiments and the rejection of some of the multilateralism that we've seen in parts of the West. And it's no coincidence in my mind that the countries with the highest infection rates and death tolls are the ones with the most populist leaders who've rejected the doctrine of international cooperation. You overlay that with the fact that leadership is far less technocratic in the current context, and you begin to understand why we are in the situation we're in. And I guess, you know, picking up on that.
So if I could interrupt you and ask you back then, or in return, if you're thinking about policies and institutions, and you could rank us on a scale of 0 to 10, or before you rank us, how would you characterize the policy response in terms of leadership styles and policy response styles? And if you've characterized the response, where would you score it?
So on a global level, I think the response has been fragmented. You've seen, you know, the US-China Cold War is playing out in various global institutions, including the World Health Organization, where quite clearly Donald Trump has pulled funding in the midst of a global emergency. It's like firing the firemen in the midst of a fire, which is pretty bizarre logic. And then, you know, I think it depends. You know, there's an argument that's been made here that says the more authoritarian a regime is, the more effective the response. And a lot of people.
Would you agree with that?
I don't know it's that black and white. So, I mean, I think the one thing that does stand out, though, as quite a strong defining feature is that countries that have been led by women have performed really effectively. And you take the examples of Germany, New Zealand, Iceland, Norway, where, you know, and I think there's definitely something there. Maybe it's a function of female leadership being far more inclusive, maybe being far more empathetic and kind, as opposed to command and control, egotistical styles of leadership. I guess it's probably a little bit early to tell, but I think that has been an interesting thing that's come out of this. I think
New Zealand, that we talk about in the article, is the standout example of just a very broad-minded, inclusive, comprehensive, coherent response.
But the word that you mentioned there that I think is so important is inclusion. And I think countries which prioritize that have been the most effective. You know, Estonia is another example where they prioritize not just the hard facts and figures and the numbers, but it's about the quality of life and the quality and well-being of their citizens. And they've made remarkable strides in the use of technology to increase and enhance public trust and leadership over there. So, you know, there are examples there, and that's something that we touch on in the article, where we look at kind of, forget the new normal, but the new. And if we've got a blank slate and we need to reimagine things, what are our priorities, first of all? And I think the well-being of the most vulnerable in society is extremely important. Things like the environment, mental health, because the futures of the rich and the futures of the poor are inextricably linked. And I don't think there's any getting away from that, because inequality is a global pandemic that we need to solve. So I think that's one example. But you know, picking up on that, you know, the inclusion theme is one that I think is not just.
Hang on, like a good politician, you've avoided my question. Fantastic answer. You haven't answered my question. I want you to score us out of 10. I want you to score the world out of 10 in terms of policy responses.
I would say, again, I'm going to geographically disseminate my answer. I would give Asia in general an 8, and I would give the Western world a 5. Yeah. So
and I pushed South Africa to later in the conversation. Where would you score South Africa's response?
So I think South Africa's response has been mixed. I think we started off quite well. The assurance and the calmness and the decisive nature of the lockdown, closing the borders, and the decisiveness of leadership and the social compacting, I think would get an 8 from me on that score. I think then the healthcare response, also really strong start in terms of evidence-based policies, transparent communication, and giving the public confidence and maintaining the political buy-in. Where I think we've fallen down quite badly is in terms of the coordination, as I mentioned. Economically, it took a while to announce a stimulus. When it did come out, it was a bazooka. The Reserve Bank have played their part, but these steps need to be integrated into the entire picture. Then, of course, you had the tobacco legislations and the seemingly arbitrary nature of a lot of these, which were not consistent with the logic. You had the contradictions, which began to erode some of that public trust and confidence. So I think on the whole, South Africa hasn't done badly in terms of its response, but I think you'd be able to evaluate that across phases. We know the peak is still yet to come. We know that the infection rates are going up now. So the true test, I think, will still be forthcoming for the administration.
Maybe we could turn our attention in the balance of time to thinking about where we go from here. Lavo asked the question about capital markets, and I think we've addressed that, or hope we've addressed it. Heidi Edwards is asking about, look how far we've got. We've done half an hour, and I don't think anyone has used the word pivot. But here we are. So Heidi is asking about what's the implication for education. There's an example. I've had the experience at the business school of having to convert my entire macroeconomics core course from in classroom to remote digital in the space of weeks. Very different modes of learning. You can reach, of course, far more people. Questions about effectiveness and intimacy and connection are still to be answered. But there's lots of ways in which this, where this moment, this is Arundhati Roy's point about the pandemic as a portal, that this allows us to reinvent, that we can step through in a different shape or form. And you asked me earlier, are we going to V or W or L? And my desperate plea is that we don't do any of those, is that we come out as a letter that we've never seen before.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I think that was sort of a question or a prompting to you to thinking about.
Yeah, I think
you in the intro you spoke about it's not or, it's and.
Yeah. So I think, back to this discussion around people or the economy, lives or livelihoods, and this very binary viewpoint that we've adopted, where we prioritize growth, profit, all of these kind of things at all costs. I think quite clearly there needs to be a shift for sustainability's sake from shareholder value to stakeholder value around an inclusive society. We've pointed to a couple of examples in the public sector around countries like New Zealand and Estonia, but in the private sector as well. I think we need to acknowledge that the nature, the scale, the depth of our challenges in a South African context, but also in a global context, are so significant that we're not going to be able to solve these problems in silos. So it can't be only government, only the private sector, only labor, and there needs to be cooperation. And one of the silver linings that I will take out of this is in crisis there's opportunity, and we've seen business and government working in a manner that's collaborative for the first time in a long time. I think the all hands on deck approach, which we've seen manifest through the Spire initiative, through the Cobra response, through various companies, AB and Bev converting the alcohol for their beverages into sanitizer, multi-choice making channels kind of free to air for public education around the virus. These are
waiving the fees of transfer.
Yeah, exactly. So these are, I think, examples of what can be done when you're forced to innovate. But that requires this completely different mindset of being pragmatic, being solutions oriented, and being forward looking, and not bound by two-dimensional capitalism or socialism. Because there's a big debate now around, are we going to pivot to the left or pivot to the right? And again, the point is, how are we solving the problems? These solutions are complex, they're nuanced, and we don't have the luxury of being able to pick one or the other. So I think from that perspective, what's traditionally known as soft infrastructure, investment in people, in healthcare, in education, is a priority because, as I've mentioned before, and as we alluded to in the article, inclusive growth is the business case. And this is where I think the penny is starting to drop in the private sector, where people are realizing that their futures, their profits, their sustainability are linked to the well-being of their employees. Tony Elumelu, Nigerian billionaire and philanthropist, has coined the term Afro-capitalism, which I think is a conceptualization of this idea that you can do well and you can do good simultaneously, and that making money and doing well for society are not mutually exclusive.
So there's those of you who've got loaded questions, please pop them onto the chat function. If there are any questions, it would be great to pick those up in the last part of our conversation. But you and I, Ronak, we were talking this morning, and we were talking around the circumstance that we find ourselves in now. And it's, to alliterate, it's an environment of debt, deficit, disease, maybe another D is dysfunction, that we've got exclusive economies, pursuit of profit, people left behind, that there are all of these voids and gaps, inequalities, discontinuities, and that brings us then to ways in which we can use this moment of crisis to reinvent and reimagine. These are also overused terms now. And in the paper, we've spoken about some examples, including the likes of AB InBev, which you've made reference to, multi-choice, Safaricom, which says that they're waiving all of the fees on M-Pesa, Leon, the UK restaurants business, which shifted their business from sit down to walk in, and kept not only their staff in employ, but also looked after their supply chain. And it acknowledges that the entire suite it's a system. And you're also referencing that you can't solve this in silos, you have to solve it as a collective. So, I've got some thoughts as we go to bringing this to a head on what tomorrow looks like. I've dodged that bullet from you, but maybe I can ask you in thinking about what does it look like from here? What needs to be done to make this different?
Are you talking on a South African level or on a more global level?
Maybe I can say you choose.
Okay, so I think the kind of, I've spoken quite extensively around the need to shift what we value in society, move away from people or profits to people and profits. And that kind of mentality needs to shift. So we need to first of all, do that. Then I think, from a very pragmatic and practical perspective, from an economic management perspective, we need to restore confidence in our economies. You need coordination, you need coherence, you need confidence. And looking at it in a South African and a Pan-African context, too often we are our own worst enemies and we score own goals. So we need to kind of provide an environment, an economic environment where we're transparent and we're clear around policies. And this is particularly important in a context where, given the disruptions in the world, where potentially we're going to see less foreign direct investment as countries retreat, close their borders, become more insular. We're going to potentially see less foreign aid. We're going to see less demand and therefore a knock on commodity prices. We're only able to control what's in our control. So effectively, confidence is a cheap stimulus, and you do that by differentiating yourself as being the best of the rest. And I think the way you can do this is by being clear. Then I think from a South African perspective and a Pan-African perspective, I think the need for organic solutions, particularly under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, becomes really important, because that is something where we can reduce our dependency on the rest of the world. As I've mentioned, this has held up a mirror. It's exposed our vulnerabilities to boom bust kind of scenarios and our dependence on the likes of China and the West. And I think an African set of solutions to an African problem, where South Africa, for example, leverages the continent, both from a public sector perspective and the private sector, and we catalyze, we build those supply chains, those value chains, we integrate, is an automatic economic stimulus as well. And I think those would be the top two areas which I would prioritize.
Melvin is asking here, 11 years of economic evidence, or observing 11 years of economic evidence, insufficient to prompt any meaningful departure from policy dogma. I should have read the 11 years before asking if his question was SA or global. But I'm going to venture back that there is dogma going on both globally and domestically. And the dogma that's going on globally remains very much, until now, Washington consensus based. And that domestically, the dogma remains very much, well, here's a play on words, not Washington, just consensus, that we will try and please everyone without taking tough decisions. And the crisis globally, I think, has forced that lens to look at the inequality, the exclusion, the dysfunction, the nationalism, the chest beating, and domestically, it obliges us to forget about introspection. The moment is here. You can't get to 100% debt to GDP and just keep promising and promising and promising. So in South Africa, one of the questions or another question that's popped up is, what do we expect from the finance minister tomorrow? If I'm going to speculate on what the finance minister proposes, I'm going to be wrong. That's the world of economics. I'll tell you what I desperately wish he does. And that is address the one deficit that is inside of his capability, and that is the deficit between promise and delivery. So South Africa for years now has got into the habit of talking about all types of transitions and transformations and redressing poverty and repairing infrastructure and fixing state-owned enterprises and working on tax compliance. This is not pointing just at the public sector. This is a collective problem. And we have this yawning deficit between what is promised and what is delivered. So tomorrow, all of the emphasis will be on the fiscal deficit, how much we're promising to spend versus, or undertaking to spend versus how much we think that we can collect. I think that the deficit is the deficit in trust, the deficit in policy coherence, and the deficit in delivery. And if we can fix those three deficits, no amount of money is going to solve South Africa's problems until we've fixed those three deficits. So what I'm very hopeful of tomorrow is that we will start to see real evidence that I'm going to call it Mboweni's 77-pager, but the Treasury paper that was released last year. All of the ingredients that we need are in that document. Everything that we need is there. except the delivery. So will he have the courage in this moment to turn from talking about it to actually turning it into, well, we're going to do it now. And this is going to start with right-sizing the SOEs, ownership structures, cutting back on public sector wage bill, levels of accountability throughout the public sector, and then important structural reforms that are not public sector, but private sector, including, amongst other things, I've referenced tax buoyancy and tax compliance. Industry after industry in South Africa is concentrated. Now we're looking way beyond budget delivery. But to me, that's the stuff that we need to see tomorrow, is we don't need to hear promises and talk, and we'll spend the next 3 days analyzing what was told to us. We have to obsess and insist on delivery.
On that
I think
note,
I'm lecturing now, Ronak, sorry.
Yeah, I think on that note, we are unfortunately out of time, but I think that's, you know, a marginally optimistic note, which we'll take. But thank you to you, Adrian, for the discussion. Looking forward to the next article. And thank you to the audience for your engagement and your participation. We hope you enjoyed it. We will be having another GIBS forum again on Friday, so stay tuned for details on that around the social media pages. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Ronak. Thanks, everyone.